So I've gone over the lecture material for this quiz. Anybody need to hear anything else explained? In addition, go back over any of this stuff in more depth, anything from your book or from the online reading. Remember, there's that one online reading on scientific terms, and there will be at least a few questions out of that reading on this test. Just make sure you did the reading. Most of you already have a basic understanding of those terms if you've taken any science class, a biology class, it's always the same terms. But if you've never been exposed to that before, now you have. Any other questions? Yeah.
I understand correlation about facilities on causality.
Yeah. Let me do that. Let me just jump ahead a little bit. Tell you what. Let me just jump ahead and go to the lecture because let me go to All right. Correlation is merely an association between two or more variables. They happen together. One happens right after another. There's something going on. There's a connection between a couple of things. Correlation is vague. Correlation is most of the time, but sometimes not all of the time. But there's probably something going on. That's correlation. Very, very vague. It is an association between two or more variables. This is an example of correlation. The little kid, I don't know if you can read this, says, he's sitting there on an airplane. He says, I wish they didn't turn on those overhead signs so much. Every time they do, it gets bumpy. What's going on? There is an association between turning on the light, saying, please stay seated, strap in your seatbelt, and getting bumpy. What's that called?
Correlation.
Correlation. Correlation is merely a vague association between things. One thing happens, the other thing tends to happen after it, before it. Now, causation is much more specific. Causation is not a vague association, it's very specific. It always, always happens. You know exactly what's going on. The technical term is you have the necessary conditions to produce an outcome. But it's along the same these kind of lines. Two atoms of hydrogen combine with one atom of oxygen to produce one molecule of water. That's not 5 times out of 10. That's not 8 times out of 10. That's not 9 times out of 10. That is 10 times out of 10. You know exactly what's going on. This is what causation is. This is, in this case, what water is. We know everything about it. We know what makes water. Correlation, vague. Causation, specific. Correlation, most of the time. Causation, all of the time. Something going on with correlation, we know exactly what's going on with causation. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay. An example I often use to show you correlation is malaria. Malaria is a disease associated, this is from medical science, with exposure to swamp air. Is there a strong correlation between exposure to swamp air and a disease called malaria? Yes. The closer you live to the swamp, the higher the rates of malaria. The farther away from the swamp you live, the lower the rates of malaria. The more you leave the windows open at night so the swamp air can come in, the higher the rates of malaria. The more you close those windows at night, the lower the rates of malaria. There is an association between the disease known as malaria and swamp air. What kind of association is that?
Correlation.
Correlation. And that's where the term itself comes from with malaria. Malaria. That's Latin, but Spanish helps. What does that mean?
Bad air.
Bad air. Bad air. That is, however, a correlation. Because what's really going on? What's going on? Basic. I think so. Malaria? What is it? What's causing it? Mosquito bites of a particular kind of mosquito, the Anopheles mosquito. And it's not even so much the mosquito, it's the bacteria in the saliva of the mosquitoes, which injected when they drink your blood, causes malaria. Now we're at the level of causation. When we're just talking this vague association, it is correlation. Does that help? Okay, great. Any other questions? Any other review questions in preparation for your quiz? Happy to answer questions as long as you want. But your tests are important. Not, I'm going to go back and do lecture until 8:45. Please remind me at 8:20 to shut up and stop me, throw things at me at 8:45 because you'll need at least half an hour for your quiz. Okay? Yeah?
There was a question on the last test that was like survival of the fittest is best attributed to either Karl Marx or Charles Darwin.
No. Karl Marx, Charles Darwin, or
Spencer.
Spencer. You had the class late. You weren't around for that lecture. It's Spencer. It's Herbert Spencer. I think it's Darwin. No. Darwin spoke of natural selection. Herbert Spencer came along and added that handy little one-line phrase and used it to describe society. Herbert Spencer. Look it up. Look it up. All right. Any other questions? I can tell you're not convinced. My friend Mike Golden over in biology knows my students when he takes his biology classes. He always says, "Who said survival of the fittest?" And he tells me, "Greg, I can always tell a student who took your class because they always correctly say it was Charles." No, it was Herbert Spencer. Okay, so that's Mike Golden too, biologist over in biology department. All right. All right. Any other questions? Questions? Cool. All right, let me go back to the lecture. Make the transition to talk about crime. From crime to science and method. Look, if I've done this conversation right around crime, it started off so cool, it was like really totally interesting. But if I did it right, by the end it was seriously boring. Because that's what sociology does. It looks at interesting stuff and makes it boring, which is different than journalism. Journalism will also talk about crime, and it will fascinate you. The one thing it won't be is boring, because they know how to write. They know how to frame a story. They know how to focus on the stuff that's most interesting. But they'll also focus on people like your serial killers, because they are fascinating for most people. That's not what's really going on. And that's the key. Sociology at least attempts to use the scientific method to understand the stuff we see in society. As interesting as that is, a sociologist needs to make it boring in some sense because they are using data, information, and science. Let me give you the simplest definition of science I can think of, and I'll keep making this more and more complicated. Science, at its simplest, it's up there. Yeah, is a search for truth. Truth. But not just any kind of truth. No, there's many kinds of truths in life. There is religious truth, which is based in what? Faith. Faith. There's political truth, which is based in loyalty to country. All of those are wonderful kinds of truths. But science has a very narrow measure of what is truth. Science is none of those kinds of things. Science has one concern and one concern at all, and it's the version of truth is something called empirical truth. What does empirical mean? Empirical, what does that mean? Yeah. Yeah, available to your senses, capable of observation, and I would add to this, it's most simple. What that means is that it is measurable. You can measure it. And that is the one true God of science. Can you put a ruler on it and measure how long it is? Can you count it and see how many of them there are? Can you put it in a mass spectrogram and break it down and understand what it's composed of? Measurement, measurement, measurement is what science is all about. Period. End of story. If you cannot measure it, you can't do science. Now, there are a lot of things in life, and that's where religious truth comes in. If you're asking questions about good, bad, evil, right, wrong, can science answer those kinds of questions? Impossible. Impossible. Science can only tell you what it can measure. Now, can it measure the impact of one version of right or wrong and its impact on behavior? Sure, that can do it. If you're interested, for example, in gun ownership, could you measure the impact of religious orientation and gun ownership? Do Protestants own more guns than Catholics? Do Catholics own more guns than Jews? Is that something that science can answer? Yes, because you can count it, you can measure it. Very, very specific kind of truth. It is a measurable truth. And therefore, can science tell people issues of morality, whether abortion should be legal or not? No, it cannot. It has no business meddling in an area that involves a different truth. Can science tell you whose God is best? Absolutely not. Science has no business walking into a church and trying to meddle in a very different kind of truth based in moral faith. I mean, there's this guy, Richard Dawkins, who's an atheist scientist, and he says, atheism is the only defensible position. God doesn't exist, and I can prove it. He is mixing two kinds of truths. He's saying that science can dictate what is a moral response based in faith. That is completely wrong. You cannot have science dictating moral attitudes. You can't tell your God is wrong. You can't tell you there is no God. That is a matter of individual spiritual faith. But the inverse, the opposite of that is also true. And this is where it gets controversial. Moral truths, political truths have no right to dictate to science what their conclusions are. Because science has only one means of evaluating good science, and that is whether it has stood up to the best evidence. And here I'm talking about things, let's start at least controversial, political involvement in science. This is a real story. It had a considerable consequence because somebody thought that their moral truths, their political truths, were more important than the science. World War II. A race is taking place. War is the background. The Second World War is taking place, and the race is to use science to create a weapon. At that time, the beginning of the Second World War, the state of physics says there was a lot of energy locked up in the structure of the atom. If you were able to unlock that structure, all